Welcome to another episode of the Restoration Obscura Field Guide, a podcast that unearths the forgotten corners of history and brings them back into the light. Each episode goes beyond headlines and textbook dates into the places, decisions, and moments that helped shape our world, even if they were left off the official record. These stories are built from archives, old photographs, and the physical traces still etched into the landscape. Here's your host, photographer, historian, and the creator of Restoration Obscura, John Bulmer.
Welcome to the Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast. I'm your host and the creator of Restoration Obscura, John Bulmer. In this episode, we're covering the Abair Bigfoot Incident in Whitehall, New York. I want to be clear from the start. This isn't an investigation meant to prove or disprove anything. My work with Restoration Obscura is about the stories we choose to tell and what those stories reveal about us. You'll hear accounts that line up and others that don't. You'll hear language borrowed from films, from headlines, and from late-night retellings. All of it matters because it shows how a story takes shape, how a private encounter can be claimed by an entire community as part of its identity. If you came here looking for a verdict, you may leave without one. If you came to consider why this story lives on, you're in the right place. That's the ground we will walk together. Respect for the witnesses, respect for the skeptics, care for the facts we can hold in our hands, curiosity for the parts we cannot. With that in mind, let's begin. Act 1, Frame 3, 52. Before we can talk about Abair Road, we need to talk about a film. In truth, all Bigfoot stories after 1967 carry its shadow. I'm talking about the Patterson Gimlin film, shot along Bluff Creek in Northern California. If you've ever seen a clip of Bigfoot, chances are it was this one. A shaky reel of 16mm film showing a tall, fur-covered figure striding across a stream bed. It moves from left to right. It steps across fallen logs. It turns its head and torso toward the camera, then disappears into the trees. That short sequence has been replayed, slowed down, blown up, stabilized, and analyzed more than perhaps any piece of amateur footage ever taken. Maybe second only to Abraham Zapruder's film from Dealey Plaza. Both are grainy, shaky, and orbit the same cultural gravity. For some, the Bluff Creek footage is the single best evidence that a creature like Bigfoot exists. For others, it's the most successful hoax in the history of cryptozoology. I first saw it the way many people my age did, on In Search Of, narrated by Leonard Nimoy. It was eerie and riveting, especially for a kid raised on Sunday Creature double features on cable. Nimoy's voice told you that mysteries were real, that the world was stranger than it appeared. And then there it was, the figure at Bluff Creek, looking back over its shoulder. I was hooked. I found a paperback about Sasquatch at a school book fair and read it cover to cover. I watched The $6 Million Man, where Steve Austin battled a Bigfoot played by Andre the Giant. All of it created a cultural picture of the creature long before I'd ever heard of Whitehall or Abair Road. At the core of Restoration Obscura is photography. Every fragment of the past we recover, whether a faded print, a lost negative, or a scrap of film, is first and foremost a photographic artifact. The Patterson Gimlin film is no different. To understand why this 60 seconds of shaky footage has endured, we have to look not only at what it shows, but at how it was made. The mystery lies as much in the camera as in the creature. The film was shot on October 20th, 1967, by Roger Patterson and his friend Bob Gimlin in the forests of Humboldt County, California. Patterson, an amateur filmmaker with a fascination for Bigfoot, borrowed money to rent a Cinekodak K 116mm motion picture camera. It was sturdy, all metal, and operated by spring tension, designed for field use. The K100 used reversal film, which produced a positive image directly on the original stock. No negative, no intermediary print. What Patterson captured was not a copy, but the very strip of film that passed through the camera gate at Bluff Creek. I have one in my collection, and holding it explains the shake immediately. The K100 could shoot at multiple frame rates, and Patterson had it set near the standard 24 frames per second. At that speed, the reel runs just under a minute, about 954 frames. The lens had a fixed focal length, no zoom, so we had to close the distance on foot. That's why the famous sequence shows him sprinting, breath ragged, camera jerking in his hand, trying to steady the frame as the figure walks away. The limitations of the setup, the grain of the film, the wobble of a spring camera, the shallow depth of field are the very qualities that kept the footage alive in debate. Researchers, skeptics, and believers have all worked from the same fragile strip of emulsion. The K100's quirks created an image just detailed enough to invite study, yet just imperfect enough to resist final judgment. Because of that technology, the mystery endured. If Patterson had shot high-definition video, the debate might have ended in hours. If he'd carried only still film, there would be no motion to analyze. But 16mm reversal film, with its grain, its light fall off, and its 1/24th second bursts, froze a single October encounter into a permanent cultural riddle. Less than a minute of film, 954 frames, stretched across half a century, it became one of the most dissected and iconic moving pictures ever made. The most famous image comes at frame 352, the moment the figure turns toward the camera mid-stride. It's the frame printed in books, magazines, and posters for decades. Close your eyes and picture Bigfoot. You're probably picturing frame 352. Supporters point to details they say defy hoaxing. The breadth of the shoulders, the length of the forearms, the flexing muscle beneath the fur, the natural turn of the head. Some even argue the figure appears female, with a broad chest and visible breasts, details no costume maker would have added in 1967. The argument goes that the anatomy is too complex, too convincing to be a man in a suit. Skeptics disagree. They point to Patterson's obsession with Bigfoot. He'd written a book the year before, and they argue he was motivated to create evidence. They remind us that the film speed was never recorded. At 16 frames per second, the gait looks alien. 24, it looks human. Without certainty on that one detail, analysis becomes slippery. There are also claims of a confession. Bob Hieronymus said he wore the costume, and a costume maker, Philip Morris, claimed he sold Patterson the suit. Believers countered, but the fact remains. The film's provenance has always been disputed. And yet, frame 352 continues to hold people. Look long enough, and you might see muscles under fur. Look again, and you might see seams, or a man glancing back to check his mark. The power of that frame lies in its ambiguity. It doesn't prove or disprove, it forces you to decide what you believe. For me, the fascination was never about certainty. It was more about perception, about what happens when you project your imagination into the dark. That's why the film took root the way it did. It arrived at the perfect cultural moment. Television could carry it into homes. Paperbacks could circulate it through schools. Shows like In Search Of could wrap it in mystery and authority. The Patterson Gimlin film gave us a visual vocabulary for Bigfoot. Before 1967, the creature was an unvisualized rumor, line drawings and charcoal sketches. Afterward, it had a body, a stride, a gesture. Frame 352 became the template. When people reported sightings, they compared what they saw to that image. When artists drew Bigfoot, they drew frame 352. When skeptics mocked, they mocked that walk, that look over the shoulder. I've spent time in places where darkness is absolute. No streetlights, no noise of civilization. In those woods, the smallest sound feels enormous. A branch snaps, a shape moves, a voice echoes. The mind races to fill the gap between fear and reason. Those conditions breed stories. They amplify uneasy imagination. They're the atmosphere from which legends grow. That's what the Patterson Gimlin film gave to the world, a backdrop against which every later story would play out. By the time the Abair Road incident took place in Whitehall in 1976, the witnesses weren't just seeing something in the dark. They were seeing an image they already knew. They had grown up with In Search Of, with school paperbacks, with Steve Austin fighting Bigfoot on television. The creature on Abair Road was seen through the lens of Bluff Creek. We begin here because it's impossible to talk about Abair Road without it. Whether you see a hoax or a mystery, that strip of 16mm film is the ghost behind the headlights on that Adirondack Road. It's the reason frame 352 still circulates in books and on screens, and the reason a town like Whitehall could turn a late-night sighting into an enduring legend. By the summer of 1976, people already knew the silhouette, the stride, the turn of the head. When headlights swept across Abair Road and something stepped into the beam, the story that followed was not born in isolation. It was born in the shadow of Bluff Creek. And that's where we turn in Act 2. The following segment explores reports of Bigfoot sightings in and around Whitehall, New York during the mid-1970s, including the well-known 1976 encounter on Abair Road. Accounts from that period describe multiple witnesses, including civilians and law enforcement officers, who claim to have seen a large, unidentified creature near the edge of town. This discussion is not an exhaustive record of every reported sighting in the area. Many additional accounts exist, drawn from personal memories and local storytelling traditions that span decades. Recollections change from person to person and over time, and the details often differ depending on who is telling the story. The purpose of this segment is to explore the cultural and historical significance of these events rather than to verify or catalog every report. Act 2. The Night on Abair Road. By the summer of 1976, Whitehall, New York, was like many small towns on the edge of the Adirondacks, surrounded by rolling farmland with dark ridgelines leaning against the horizon, a place where night arrived all at once. Streetlights ran through the center of town but fell away quickly at the outskirts. Beyond that faint perimeter were hayfields and stretches of second-growth forest, stitched together by narrow county roads. On those roads, the dark felt complete. Your headlights didn't slice through it so much as carry a short tunnel of light ahead of you. It was late August when Abair Road became more than just another back road in Whitehall. The air was heavy, the way late summer air carries the last heat of the day into midnight. Insects rasped in the ditches and the darkness seemed absolute. By the mid-1970s, the night outside of town was far darker than it is today. Once you left the faint halo of Main Street, you were under skies that would have rated around a Class 3 on the Bortle scale, a rural night sky where the Milky Way stretched clearly overhead and thousands of stars created a dome across the sky. The Bortle scale runs from Class 1, the purest black skies left on Earth, to Class 9, the permanent twilight of a city where only the brightest stars remain visible. Whitehall's countryside in 1976 fell toward the darker end, closer to a natural night than what most of us know now. Today, typical suburban skies sit around Class 6 or 7, washed in the glow of shopping plazas and the dome of distant cities. Under those conditions, the Milky Way disappears, erased by light that never truly turns off. Back then, the dark was still whole. It turned the landscape into shadow on shadow. Teenagers cruised those roads with the radio low. Officers eased along the back roads, scanning for drunk drivers. What happened next depends on which witness you ask, but the heart of it begins the same way. A set of headlights, a sweep of light across a field, a figure where no figure should be. One version starts with a truck nosing along Abair Road, tires crunching on gravel. There's a break in the greenery, an opening into a pasture. The driver, already spooked by talk around town, swings the spotlight across the gap. The beam slides over cattails, over the posts of a wire fence, over a knot of scrub trees at the field's edge. Then it hits something upright, broad, standing square in the light. For a fraction of a breath, it holds. The driver's mind looks for the nearest familiar category. Cow, horse, man in a coat, none of them fit. The shoulders are too wide, the arms too long, the head too deep set. The eyes catch the light and flash red the way some animals' eyes do. Then the figure takes a step that looks wrong for a person. Longer, heavier, more grounded. Silence fills the cab like pressure. Another version has teenagers parked a few bends away, windows cracked to pull in the night air. They hear a sound. not a coyote, not an owl, not a farm dog, a deep, chesty sound that seems to come from two directions at once. It rolls through the summer growth and bounces off the trunks of trees until it's hard to place. It rises once as a moan, drops into a rumble, then stops. Nobody breathes for a second because everyone's listening for the next one. When it doesn't come, someone says, "Go." Keys scrape. Headlights follow the curve of the road toward that opening in the pasture. At some point, the radios crackled to life. A call went out. An officer answered. Soon a second car pulled in. The field stayed quiet and unchanged. A spotlight began a slow sweep, tracing the same circle over fence posts and cattails before swinging back to the trees. Something shifted just inside the first line of trunks. The beam returned and held. For the second time in a few minutes, witnesses saw the same unusual shape, an upright figure, taller than any man they knew, broad through the torso, hair catching the light in uneven clumps. It didn't run. It stepped back, turned, moved sideways into the woods, covering ground faster than a run, but without urgency. Then it was gone, taken out of sight by the dark. Later, when the stories were passed around at kitchen tables and diner counters, certain details came back again and again. The smell. Some said there was a rank, organic scent like damp fur and wet earth. The sound of movement. A few recalled the weight of it, the ground giving a soft thud you felt more than heard. The eyes. Almost everyone mentioned the eyes. Not lanterns, not lights of their own, something that caught and flared when the beams struck. In each retelling, those details shifted slightly, and memory folded in on itself. One part sharpened, another fell away. Fear played a role too. It made the shadow taller, the sound heavier, the eyes brighter. What people agreed on was less a record than a need, a way to make sense of what they thought they saw. What followed is the part that hardened the story. People got out of trucks. Boots stepped into grass still wet from humidity. Flashlights swept. The field showed its normal life. Moth wings, spider webs strung between stalks. A milkweed burst into silky thread. Whatever the truth, the image remains the same. A group of people gathered in a circle of light, standing at the edge of something they couldn't name and could not dismiss. Even within that circle, belief divided. One person said it was a bear. Another answered that no bear they had seen moved like that on two legs. Someone brought up the Patterson Gimlin film and swore the shoulders looked the same. Someone else said costumes exist, pranks happen, and teenagers have time on their hands in late summer. A third voice, quieter, said they didn't know what they saw. That admission carried more weight than either verdict. What happens after a night like that is its own part of the story. Word spread. The town's daytime looked different because the nighttime now carried more. People revisited the scene in daylight to tame it with visibility. They pointed out distances and fence lines. They tried to prove to themselves that the field was just a field. But sunset comes early in late August when clouds drag the sky down. The moment the light went, the story recovered its power. The bushes grew higher again. The pasture opened the way it had the night before. Quiet sounded louder than it should. There were follow-up nights. Patrol cars rolled past more often. Teenagers made a point of being there, drawn by a mix of fear and bravado. The odd theater of search returned, spotlights, radios, brief bursts of excitement, and long stretches where nothing happened except that everyone listened. These encounters are just two of the many I came across while researching this episode. If you know of the Abair Road story, you may have heard entirely different versions. That's the thing about legends like this. There is no single official narrative when so many people feel a kind of collective ownership over the memory. Over time, the story splinters. I heard accounts of brief sightings and others that stretched into long, detailed retellings. Each one carried a trace of conviction, as if the teller had brushed against something real. Yet decades later, all of it remains impossible to verify. What survives isn't evidence, but the persistence of belief, the way a story refuses to fade, even when its details shift with every telling. If you've ever stood in a field with other people in the dark, you know how the silence fills with what each person expects. A twig snaps and 10 heads turn. A shadow slides and someone lifts a beam to chase it. In some versions of the Abair story, officers spotted the figure a second time on a different night. In others, the primary sighting remained the anchor and everything else was an echo. The echoes mattered. They were the proof that a story had legs in a community. People began using the same words: broad, tall, red eyes in the light, long stride. Repetition gave the story a skeleton. Differences gave it life. Skeptics did what skeptics should do. They asked about distances. How far was the figure from the road when the light hit it? How much of what you saw is reconstruction? They walked the field in daylight and identified stumps, shrubs, and folds in the land. They brought up bear behavior, how a black bear can rear up, how eyes can reflect red, how wind can carry scent. They mentioned mask lines, costume seams, and the human taste for pranks. They noted that fear bends memory, and that once a story catches, witnesses can borrow details without knowing it. Believers did what believers should do. They pointed to the steadiness of descriptions across separate witnesses. They emphasized scale, how the head came to a certain line on a fence post, how the shoulders filled the gap between two saplings. They reminded you that people who hunt, farm, and live on those roads know the difference between a person and a bear. They talked about the way the figure moved as if the ground were built for it, a stride that wasted nothing. Between those two positions is where most people stood. It's also where the town began to change. Groceries, gas stations, and the diner on Main Street became places where a new piece of the story was added or reshaped. Laughter entered the retellings and then left again when the speaker returned to the moment the light hit the figure. Night after night, the fields were the same. Night after night, people who were never there imagined what they would have done if they had been. You could feel a place trying to decide what it believed about itself. What the Abair Road incident reveals, even before we reach the question of proof, is how a single night can turn a private experience into a public event. Headlights sweep across the trees and catch something. People are pulled into the same circle of light. They reach for the language they already know: Patterson Gimlin, frame 352, shoulders, stride, eyes, a shorthand that gives form to the unknown. The 1967 film is present in every comparison. It guides the questions, it shapes the answers, it fixes the posture people imagine when they close their eyes. The story on Abair Road begins in Whitehall, but it grows in a world that had already been introduced to the possibility of such things. There is another part of the aftermath. It shows up in conversations years later. People say they drove more slowly past that field for a while. They avoided pulling over there at night even when they needed to make a call. For a few weeks, they brought their dogs in earlier. The practical adjustments were small, but they registered. A town's relationship to its edges changed. The margin between lit and unlit space gained thickness again. The urge to document intensified. Reporters arrived with a camera crew for a short segment on the local news. Being filmed makes you rehearse your own memory. You tell it in a sequence that fits a 90-second package. You emphasize the part you think the viewer needs. Later, you realize you left something out or added a phrase you borrowed because it felt right. This is how a legend assembles itself, not dishonestly, but socially, with the town assisting. I keep thinking about the teenagers in those parked cars, not the ones who swear they saw it, but the ones who only heard secondhand and still went looking. What drew them out was not a hunt for a monster, but the appetite for a charged moment when something might happen, the place where fear and curiosity overlap. The night's generous with that kind of space, leaves just enough room for the unknown to take a shape. You don't have to see a creature to feel a story forming around you. Abair Road became more than a location, it became a shorthand. Say the name and people in Whitehall know what you mean. They know the field, they know the bend, they know the feeling of driving past with the cab lights off and the radio down because everything in you wants to listen. The incident moved from police logs and rumor into identity. The town that went about its business one week was now the town that would, for a long time, be asked about Bigfoot. The night on Abair Road ends the way most mysteries do, not with a clean conclusion, but with questions. The fields return to stillness. The spotlights fade, but the questions live on and multiply. But stories don't stop when the light goes out. They move into conversation, into memory, into the everyday life of a town that suddenly carries something unexplainable. In Act 3, we'll turn from the field itself to what followed, how Whitehall absorbed the story, how belief and skepticism began their long negotiation, and how a single night in 1976 became part of the town's identity. Act 3, the aftermath. When the patrol cars left Abair Road and the last spotlights went dark, Whitehall was already changed. The story had already begun its transformation. Within days, it belonged to everyone, witnesses, skeptics, and storytellers alike. The next morning, people returned to the site. Nothing unusual appeared in daylight, but daylight has always been a poor witness to what happens in the dark. By evening, the story had already grown beyond the reach of evidence. Reporters eventually arrived. Their short television segments condensed the night into a few vivid lines. A figure, a light, a sound. Those clips gave the story permanence. Once a camera records a mystery, it stops belonging to those who lived it and starts belonging to everyone who sees it. The town adjusted in small, almost invisible ways. People kept their porch lights on longer. A few began carrying cameras in their cars. The field became a landmark, a place pointed out to visitors. For a while, the question wasn't whether anyone believed, but how long the conversation could last. Every community develops stories that bind it together. Some are triumphant, some tragic, some unresolved. Whitehall's became a story about the line between what we know and what we imagine. It echoed through generations because it gave shape to uncertainty. All these years later, it still echoes. Since beginning Restoration Obscura, I've seen how mystery can become a kind of local history. People write to tell me about lights over lakes, voices in the woods, shapes on old back roads. Each one says more about human perception than about the unknown itself. Mystery persists because it gives language to the parts of experience that logic can't hold. That's what keeps me returning to stories like Whitehall's. The unknown is not always out there in the dark. Sometimes it's in how we make sense of what we see. The night remains a space of imagination. It alters what we notice and who we become when the light is gone. A meteor over a lake, the silhouette of trees against the sky, the sound of something moving just beyond view. These are not proof of anything supernatural, yet they remind us that mystery still has a place in the human story. For me, Restoration Obscura has always been about that intersection. History and memory, the factual and the felt. Readers tell me these stories bring them back to childhood campfires, storm blackouts, nights when the world felt larger. Others write to share moments they can't explain. What connects them all is not fear, but recognition, the sense that wonder still survives in the dark. Field Guide to the Night grew from that same impulse and continues to evolve through new work. More books, more investigations, and even fiction drawn from the same current of secrecy and silence. The stories born in the dark were what first moved me to write Restoration Obscura's Field Guide to the Night to explore how mystery connects history, imagination, and place. Now, 3 more volumes are nearly ready to be released, each carrying the same thread of inquiry, how the unseen and the forgotten shape who we are. Alongside them, I've been developing my first field novel. a work of fiction grounded in the same ideas. As we close tonight's episode, thank you for walking that edge with me. The Abair Road story is not about a creature, it is about us, how we perceive, remember, and live with the unknown. The nights and archive of human imagination. This has been the Restoration Obscura Field Guide. Thanks for listening and for keeping watch with me. This is John Bulmer. Until next time, take care. I'm excited to share that my new book, Restoration Obscura's Field Guide to the Night, is now available. This project grew out of the same work you hear on this podcast. It's an immersive history of how night has shaped human experience, from the first sky watchers and their constellations, to the wartime blackouts that changed daily life, to the hidden surveillance networks of the Cold War. It's part cultural history, part personal journey, and it invites us to step beyond today's artificial glow and rediscover what still lives in the shadows. Field Guide to the Night is available worldwide in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. If you've been enjoying the Restoration Obscura Field Guide, our deep dives into forgotten history, lost infrastructure, and the legends of the past, there's a way to be part of the story behind the scenes. We're currently welcoming select sponsorship partners for upcoming episodes and articles. Whether you're an independent brand, museum, publisher, archive, or just someone who believes in the power of storytelling, this is your chance to reach an engaged, history-loving audience across Substack, Facebook, Instagram, and all major streaming platforms. If your mission aligns with ours, preserving the past, exploring the overlooked, or just digging deeper than the headlines, we'd love to connect. For sponsor opportunities and media inquiries, contact restorationobscura@gmail.com. Let's bring more forgotten stories to light together. If you believe history is worth preserving, if you've ever paused at the ruins of an old mill or held a faded photograph and wondered about the world it came from, this space is for you. The Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast streams on all major platforms. Subscribe to support independent, reader-funded storytelling at restorationobscura.com. Copyright 2025, John Bulmer Media and Restoration Obscura. All rights reserved. Restoration Obscura explores forgotten places and overlooked histories. Visiting abandoned sites can be dangerous, unstable, and often illegal. This podcast does not encourage or endorse trespassing, vandalism, or unsafe exploration. Please respect property laws, community safety, and historic preservation efforts. Restoration Obscura draws on a range of materials, including public archives, institutional holdings, and privately preserved collections. Many images and documents have uncertain or incomplete provenance. When possible, sources are identified and credited. While we work to preserve and interpret these materials with care, not all rights of ownership reside with Restoration Obscura. All information is verified as accurate at the time of publication.
This was a Restoration Obscura broadcast. Archive reference terminated. Operation complete. Restoration Obscura signing off.